It started with a bet, one so ridiculous, so impossible, that anyone with common sense would have laughed and walked away. But Jack Brennan didn't laugh, because when you're 3 months behind on your rent, your daughter's college dreams are slipping through your fingers, and the bank calls more than your own friends do, even a bad idea starts to look like salvation. The man who made the offer had walked into the shop like he didn't belong. Clean boots, quiet confidence, and the kind of calm that only comes from someone hiding something big. Jack was under the hood of a 10-year-old pickup, the kind of job that kept the lights on, barely. He wiped his hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric and looked up, expecting another customer with a radiator leak or a battery that wouldn't hold a charge. Instead, the man introduced himself as Connor Davis and laid an envelope on the workbench with the weight of a brick and the promise of escape. $50,000, he said. Half now, the other half when the engine runs. No long-winded story, no sob story either. Just a proposition and a challenge. Fix a 1973 Ferrari Daytona V12 engine that 7 other mechanics had already declared unfixable. Not because they were lazy or careless or underqualified. 2 were Ferrari certified specialists. 1 had worked on race cars for a Formula One team. Every single one of them had failed. And now this stranger wanted Jack to take it on, not because he was famous or connected, but because, according to Connor, Jack was something better, real. The envelope was thick. Jack didn't even have to open it to know it was legit. And it made his stomach turn. That kind of money doesn't show up without strings. It never had before. But then again, neither had second chances. Not since Grace died. Not since the bank threatened foreclosure. Not since Ava got into Georgia Tech, and he'd smiled like he was proud, knowing he couldn't afford to send her. So Jack didn't say yes, not yet. But he didn't say no either. He looked around his shop, the peeling paint, the flickering overhead lights, the cracked concrete that told the story of 20 years spent working from dawn till long past dark. A shop built on honest work and stubborn hope. Jack had always told himself that fixing things was in his blood, but lately it felt like the world was trying to prove him wrong. This job, this engine, it wasn't just a repair. It was a line in the sand. Connor saw the hesitation in Jack's face. He didn't push. He didn't plead. He just said 6 words Jack wouldn't forget. If anyone can do it, you can. That's what hit hardest. Not the money, not the prestige of fixing a Ferrari, but the belief, however quiet, that Jack's kind of mechanic, the kind who learned with scraped knuckles and instinct instead of textbooks, still mattered. When Connor left, Jack stood there with the envelope in his hand and questions he couldn't answer. Who was this guy really? Why did this engine matter so much? And why him, of all people? But maybe the real question, the one that wouldn't leave him alone, was this. What if this was his shot? His one shot to do something that actually changed the story he'd been stuck in for years. Mason, his young assistant, had watched the whole thing unfold from across the shop, too stunned to speak until the door closed behind Connor. He finally said what they were both thinking. That's more money than we make in 6 months, Mr. B. Even if it doesn't run, that's 25 grand just for trying. Jack looked down at the envelope, then back at the empty appointment book. 2 oil changes and a maybe on a transmission that the customer couldn't afford to fix. That was their week, maybe their month. He didn't know what was waiting inside those crates when they arrived, or what ghosts were tangled up in that engine. But he knew what was waiting if he said no. More empty pages, more sleepless nights, more watching the shop he'd built inch toward bankruptcy. So he made a decision, not with excitement, but with the tired, cautious resolve of a man who knew what failure felt like and was ready to risk it one more time. "Tell him to bring the engine," Jack said. "Let's see what I'm really up against." The engine arrived in 3 massive wooden crates, each one sealed tight with rusted bolts and decades of mystery. The flatbed truck pulled onto the cracked pavement outside Brennan's auto just after 2 in the afternoon. Its diesel engine grumbling like it knew the weight it carried wasn't just physical, it was personal. Jack watched from the shop doorway, arms crossed, as the driver carefully lowered the cargo into the main bay. He didn't speak much, just handed over a clipboard for the signature and said, "You're braver than I am," before climbing back into his cab and pulling away. Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth was too dry, and his heart was already thudding faster than it should have been. Mason stood beside him, eyes wide as he took in the size of the crates. "It's really in there, huh?" he said, almost like he didn't believe it. Jack didn't respond at first. He was too busy staring at the biggest crate, the one with a faint stamp burned into the wood. Ferrari, Modena, Italy. He hadn't seen that kind of branding in over a decade, and even then, only once. Back when customers from Atlanta still drove an hour just to have Jack's hands on their engines. Before the economy tanked. Before Grace got sick. Before everything got hard. He grabbed a crowbar and walked to the nearest crate without a word. Mason followed, more curious than cautious. The metal groaned as Jack pried the first box open. Inside, cushioned in layers of oil-soaked cloth and reinforced foam, sat the heart of the legend, a Ferrari 512 engine block, long and heavy and unmistakably damaged. The aluminum casing, once pristine and smooth as a river stone, was now crisscrossed with fractures like veins under the skin. 3 major cracks ran from the cylinder head mounts down toward the crankcase, splintering outward like a frozen spiderweb. The damage wasn't just cosmetic, it was deep, terminal, to anyone who'd seen this kind of thing before. Jack had seen it before, but never like this. These weren't simple impact fractures from an accident. No, this engine had been under pressure long before it was ever wrecked. Mason leaned over and let out a slow whistle. How do you even begin to fix something like that? Jack didn't answer. Not yet. He was tracing the cracks with his fingers, reading them like a story only he could understand. Each fracture told him something. The stress points, the direction of the forces, the sequence of failure. This wasn't an engine that broke. It was one that was pushed until it shattered. Someone had pushed it too hard, and not just in driving, in the building, the modifications. The second crate held more pieces. Cylinder heads, a mangled intake manifold, pistons, some still in plastic, brand new, others scorched and chipped, clearly reused or overtuned. Someone had tried to fix this already. Multiple people, judging by the variety of tool marks and machining methods. The third crate was the most surprising. Instead of parts, it was full of binders, 3 of them, thick and neatly labeled. Jack opened the first and found detailed documentation, photographs of the engine, handwritten notes, parts inventories, diagnostic scans. Whoever had attempted the rebuild before him hadn't just worked on the engine. They'd studied it, logged every step, every failure, every theory about why it wouldn't run. And they had all failed anyway. It was rare, almost unheard of. Most people didn't keep records when things went wrong, especially not when they paid good money for someone else to fix it. But this was methodical, purposeful, like someone had been preparing for the right person to come along and see the whole picture. That's when Jack felt the first prickle of unease. This wasn't a test of skill. It was a message. Someone wanted the engine fixed, yes, but they wanted it done right. Done by someone who could see the big picture, not just the broken parts. He flipped through more pages, examining flowcharts and heat maps and engine timing diagrams. The original specs had been changed, not just tweaked, overhauled. The fuel system had been modified, the compression ratio increased, even the firing order adjusted. This wasn't just a restoration, it was an experiment, a prototype. Someone had tried to build something new using old bones, and it almost worked. Almost. Jack stared at the cracked block again. The stress fractures lined up with the combustion centers, meaning the engine had been generating more pressure than it was designed for, which explained the metal fatigue. Explained why traditional repair methods had failed, because this wasn't a standard failure. This was a stress collapse, one that had been building for a long time. Whoever had designed this engine hadn't accounted for how fragile ambition could make a machine. Mason was still quiet, flipping through one of the binders with the kind of reverence most people reserved for holy books. "You think you can do it?" he asked eventually. Jack didn't answer right away. He stood up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stared at the engine again. Could he fix it? Maybe. But that wasn't the real question. The real question was whether he could finish it, complete whatever vision the original builder had started before the cracks showed up, before the engine died, and maybe before the man who built it did too. "Someone put their whole life into this," Jack said, his voice low, almost reverent. "They weren't just building a car. They were building something that hadn't been done before." He closed the binder and set it down carefully, like it was something precious. They didn't fail. They just ran out of time. Mason didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Jack could feel the weight of what this was becoming. It wasn't just a job anymore. It wasn't just about saving the shop, or paying the bank, or even getting Ava through school. It was about seeing something through to the end, something that had beaten everyone else, something that wasn't meant to survive, but might, if it had the right hands, and the right amount of heart. At first, nobody in Steelton knew what Jack Brennan had taken on. The crates had arrived quietly, no fanfare, no announcements, just a flatbed truck on a sleepy Tuesday afternoon, and the unmistakable hum of tension in the air. But in a town where news spreads faster than wildfire on dry brush, it didn't take long for word to get out. Someone had seen the delivery truck. Someone else caught a glimpse of the stamped wood, Ferrari, and within a day, everyone from the corner diner to the barbershop was talking. Jack Brennan, the guy who hadn't taken a real vacation in 15 years, the mechanic whose shop barely clung to life, had accepted a job that 7 specialists had failed to finish. And not just any job, a Ferrari Daytona V12 engine. From the sound of it, he was either a genius or he'd finally lost his damn mind. For the people of Steelton, it was something new to talk about, a spark in the ash of a town that hadn't seen good news in a long time. Ever since Montgomery Industries closed the mill, Steelton had been drying up. Families moved away, jobs disappeared, businesses shuttered one after the other until it seemed like the whole town was just holding its breath, waiting to exhale. And then this happened. Jack Brennan, the quiet, stubborn fixture on Gearworks Boulevard, had drawn a line in the sand. And whether he won or failed, people cared. They were watching, hoping. It started small. Rita Patterson from the diner showed up with 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag of biscuits the morning after the engine arrived. Said she had extras. Everyone knew she didn't. She watched Jack and Mason from the shop door, eyes narrowing as she peeked at the gleaming metal now spread across their workbenches. "That's the real thing, huh?" she said. Jack nodded, mouth full, chewing slowly, as if he hadn't tasted a hot breakfast in weeks. "I don't know what you're trying to do, Jack," Rita said finally, "but if you pull it off, this whole town's gonna talk about it for years." And then she left, just like that. But she came back the next day, with more food and questions. By the end of the week, the questions were coming from all directions. Eddie Patterson, Rita's nephew, stopped by and offered to sweep the shop floors in exchange for being allowed to hang around and watch. Jack, wary at first, finally said yes when he realized Eddie had a decent head for machines. Tony Romano, long retired and mostly silent these days, showed up out of nowhere and stood over the engine without saying a word. He stayed that way for nearly 10 minutes before finally muttering, "You're gonna need a hell of a welding rig for those cracks." And then, as if that settled it, he turned and walked out, but not before telling Jack he'd be back tomorrow to help with the blueprinting. That's how it started. One by one, the town leaned in. Some brought tools, some brought food, others just brought stories, support, and silence, but it all mattered. People who hadn't spoken in months found themselves side by side, arguing over bore angles and compression ratios. Retired machinists gave advice Jack hadn't asked for, but needed anyway. A former chemistry teacher at the high school volunteered to analyze the alloy composition. Dr. Wells from the community college offered use of the lab's ultrasound gear for internal stress testing. No one was being paid. They weren't even being promised anything. But it didn't matter, because the project wasn't just about the engine anymore. It had become a symbol. If Jack could fix what everyone else had given up on, maybe Steelton wasn't finished either. Mason was the first to say it out loud. Late one night, as the two of them sat in the empty shop, grease under their fingernails and exhaustion hanging thick in the air, he looked over at Jack and said, "This thing's bigger than us now, isn't it?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't have to. The signs were everywhere. People honked when they drove by. Kids pressed their noses to the glass outside the bay doors, trying to sneak a glimpse of the famous engine. And Jack, who'd spent years working in silence, found himself explaining things out loud, because someone was always listening. Steelton wasn't a place that expected miracles anymore, but it understood grit, it understood hard work, and Jack Brennan had given it something new, a challenge wrapped in cracked aluminum and old Italian engineering. The town hadn't asked for it, but now that it was here, they were investing themselves in it. Quietly, steadily, like people who'd forgotten what it felt like to believe in something. The engine was a mess. The odds were long, the pressure was mounting, and the timeline was unforgiving. But for the first time in years, people weren't just surviving. They were watching, wondering, rooting, and maybe, just maybe, starting to hope again. The truth didn't hit Jack all at once. It came in pieces, fragments buried in notes, patterns hiding inside the metal, subtle details that most mechanics would overlook, but that Jack, with decades of experience and a gut that didn't lie, couldn't ignore. He had already sensed something different about this engine. It wasn't just the unusual modifications or the painstaking documentation left behind. It was the feeling that every component told a story, a very personal one, and somewhere deep in that story was pain. Not mechanical failure, not frustration, real human pain. It was Tony Romano who said the name first. He had come by to help Jack examine the cylinder heads and brought with him a familiarity that only old friends could carry. He squinted at the intake ports, ran a hand along the casting, then frowned in a way that Jack had seen before, when something clicked in Tony's head that he didn't like. "This is David Montgomery's work," he said without looking up. Jack's wrench stopped mid-turn. "As in Preston Montgomery's son?" Tony gave a slow nod, like a man reluctant to dredge up a memory he'd buried deep. "Yeah, the kid was obsessed with this build. Came into my shop years ago asking questions about air-fuel ratios and combustion temperature mapping like he was already designing a rocket ship. Smart, way too smart for his own good. I told him once he was pushing that block harder than it was ever meant to go. He just smiled and said, 'That's where the fun starts.'" David Montgomery. The name rippled through Jack's memory like a stone hitting a quiet lake. Preston's son, the one who died in the crash. Jack remembered the story vaguely. Single car accident, late at night, no foul play, just speed and a twist in the road that proved fatal. But what hadn't been in the papers was this engine, this project, the passion David had poured into it like it was more than a machine. Now Jack understood the desperation in Connor Davis's voice when he first made the offer. The envelope full of cash, the urgency. This wasn't about a car. This was about finishing something left undone by a young man who never got the chance to complete his vision. And that made every decision Jack had to make from that moment forward feel heavier. This wasn't a job he could walk away from anymore. This was legacy work, memorial work, fixing the unfixable, not for profit, but for peace. He dug deeper into the binders. Buried near the back of one was a series of hand-drawn schematics, labeled in precise handwriting. Notes in the margins revealed a mind racing faster than the tools he had access to. Adjustments to valve timing, experiments with fuel injection pressure curves, simulations that predicted higher torque at lower RPMs. The kind of ideas you'd expect from an engineer with a full team behind him, not a 22-year-old working alone. But David had done it. Alone, yes, but not carelessly. The engine didn't fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was never finished. The man who had started it died before he could work out the final balance, the last calibration, the 1,000 little details that turned theory into function. Jack leaned over the engine block again, seeing not just the cracks in the aluminum, but the cracks in a dream. A brilliant, reckless dream that had burned too hot and too fast. He wasn't trying to fix a Ferrari, Jack murmured, almost to himself. He was trying to build something new. Mason looked up from the bench where he had been inspecting one of the intake runners. "You think he knew it wasn't going to hold?" Jack shook his head. I think he believed it would, but he never got the chance to make it safe. He was still chasing the limits. Tony, standing quietly by the doorway, added, "He built an engine for the man he wanted to become, not the driver he was that night." And that, more than anything, stuck with Jack. This wasn't just about fixing a broken engine. This was about honoring a vision that had cost a young man his life, that had shattered a family, that had haunted Connor Davis for 3 long years. Because now Jack knew who Connor was too, not just some messenger with a fat envelope. He was David's racing mechanic, a man who'd been there through every test, every breakthrough, every sleepless night in the garage, and who'd watched helplessly as his friend and driver pushed the machine too far. That was the guilt behind Connor's eyes. Not just that he'd lost someone, but that he hadn't stopped him. Now he was trying to make it right the only way he could, by giving someone like Jack the chance to finish what David started. The silence in the shop was different now, no longer routine, no longer just the quiet before another repair. It was reverent, the weight of everything that had come before, David's brilliance, his ambition, his death, settled into the air like dust that would never fully clear. But within that silence was something else too. Responsibility, not just to fix the engine, but to respect the story it carried. Jack looked at Mason, then at Tony, and finally at the engine. "We're not fixing a Ferrari," he said quietly. "We're finishing a life's work." And in that moment, with the heat of the Georgia sun casting shadows across the cracked floor, Jack Brennan made the decision that would change everything. Not because of money, not because of pride, but because he owed it to the kid who never got to hear his creation run the way it was meant to. Because someone had to see it through. Someone had to prove that even an unfinished dream could still find its ending, if placed in the right hands. The turning point didn't arrive with fanfare. It came in the form of a quiet decision. One man, one engine, and a community with more history than hope. Jack Brennan knew what he was taking on now. It wasn't just a broken machine, it was a son's legacy, a father's grief, a mechanic's redemption. And yet, even with the weight of it all bearing down, he understood something crucial. He couldn't do it alone. Not this time. Not with the stakes this high. Mason was the first to truly step up, not just as an assistant, but as a partner. The kid had learned fast in 3 years, going from a wiry teenager who barely knew how to hold a wrench to someone who now saw engines the way Jack did, as puzzles with personality. He stayed late after closing, combing through David's binders, deciphering diagrams that blended mechanical theory with the kind of intuition no textbook could teach. He started to ask smarter questions, ones Jack didn't always have immediate answers to. But that was the point. The work was evolving, and so were they. Tony Romano returned on a Thursday, not to visit, but to stay. Jack didn't ask why. He knew. There was something about this engine that called to old-school mechanics like Tony. It was the kind of challenge you didn't walk away from, not if you still had fire in your belly, not if you still believed in the art of the impossible. He brought his own tools, neatly wrapped in a faded leather roll, and went straight to work inspecting the cylinder heads for warping. The first time he saw David's modified cam timing specs, he didn't scoff like most would. He nodded slowly, lips pressed tight, then muttered, "Ambitious. But it might just work." By the end of the week, the shop didn't feel like Brennan's Auto anymore. It felt like something else, something new, a place where minds met across generations and everyone had a role to play. Dr. Patricia Wells from the local community college showed up after Mason emailed her asking for input on high-temperature alloy compatibility. She hadn't expected to care, but once she saw the crack patterns and the custom-engineered stress load diagrams, her curiosity took over. She returned the next morning with a portable scanner and 2 graduate students, one of whom ended up sleeping in his car just to be there for the next day's work. And then came the surprises. People Jack hadn't seen in years dropped by with offers of help. Old customers, former students, a retired welder named Don, who used to fabricate racing exhausts before arthritis stole his career, offered to consult on joining the aluminum block with a copper alloy insert. "I can't hold a torch steady anymore," he said, "but I can still talk a man through it." Even Billy Torres, Jack's longtime rival across town, showed up late one evening, unannounced. He walked in while Jack and Tony were inspecting the V12's main bearings. For a moment, nobody spoke. Billy looked around the shop, at the tarps on the floor, the carefully labeled parts, the whiteboard filled with equations and sketches. "He used to come to my place," Billy said. "David. Asked about throttle response. Always wanted to know more. I told him he was too smart for street racing." He paused, rubbed a hand over his jaw, then looked Jack in the eye. "If you need anything from my shop, tools, machining, whatever, it's yours. No strings." Jack didn't say thank you, he just nodded. Billy didn't expect more than that. He turned and left. Word kept spreading, but more importantly, support kept growing. It wasn't loud, it wasn't flashy. It was casseroles left in the break room, extension cords dropped off by neighbors, welding gas donated by a supplier who hadn't been paid in full for months. People didn't ask questions, they just wanted to help, because something was happening inside Brennan's auto that felt bigger than any single man, bigger than even the Ferrari engine. Ava came by after work one night, still in her apron from Rita's diner. She brought coffee, sat down next to Jack, and asked him to explain the wiring diagram David had drawn for the custom fuel injection system. He expected her to get bored. She didn't. She stayed for an hour, asking better questions than some engineers Jack had worked with. She wanted to understand, not just because it was her father's project, but because she saw the same thing he did, the miracle buried under all that metal and math. That night, after everyone had gone home, Jack stayed behind. He stood alone in the shop, staring at the disassembled pieces of David's dream. He saw the cracked block, the warped heads, the chaos of notes and calculations. But he didn't see defeat. He saw a blueprint for something extraordinary, and he realized then what had shifted, not just in the shop, but in himself. He wasn't afraid of failing anymore. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about keeping the doors open, or even about beating the odds. It was about finishing something that was left incomplete, about honoring a brilliant young man who never got the chance to hear his own creation roar to life. It was about proving once and for all that broken things, if given enough care, time, and heart, can still become something better than they were before. Jack put a hand on the cold metal of the engine block and whispered something no one else would ever hear. "Let's finish this." Time didn't pass in days anymore. It passed in torque values, voltage readings, and precise tolerances measured to the thousandth of an inch. The calendar said they had 12 days left, but inside the shop, the concept of days had stopped meaning much. Morning bled into afternoon, into midnight, into early morning again. No one worked normal hours. No one clocked in or out. Jack, Tony, Mason, Dr. Wells, even Eddie and the volunteers who drifted in and out, everyone operated on urgency, on instinct, on the unspoken understanding that if they didn't get every single thing exactly right, all of it would collapse. And every hour revealed just how close to the edge they really were. The first sign came during disassembly. What had looked like promising internal components, fresh crankshaft, new pistons, reconditioned rods, began revealing scars. Damage hidden beneath what Jack had initially thought was careful work. One of the pistons had hairline fractures just beneath the crown, invisible to the naked eye, but lethal once the engine fired. Several connecting rods had been balanced by hand, the kind of amateur job that might pass in a street racer but would never survive under the strain of David's ambitious torque curves. One by one, Jack placed them aside. He wasn't rebuilding with damaged goods. Not on this project. Then came the block itself. With Dr. Wells running the portable ultrasonic scanner and her stress mapping software humming in the background, Jack and Tony reviewed the results together. The verdict wasn't good. The cracks weren't just surface level, they ran deep through load-bearing sections of the aluminum. Patching wasn't enough. Welding would risk introducing brittleness, warping the bore geometry. Standard fixes had already failed. 7 mechanics had proved that. What they needed wasn't repair, they needed reinvention. That's when Tony came up with the idea, an old, almost forgotten technique that had once saved a racing engine decades ago. Instead of fighting the thermal expansion mismatch between aluminum and their repair alloy, they'd work with it. They'd machine control channels into the block, tiny pathways that would absorb and redirect stress away from critical areas. They'd use an aluminum-bronze composite with better fatigue resistance and apply it in thin, tensioned layers. "We'll give the block permission to flex," Tony said, sketching the idea on the back of an old invoice. "Make the cracks part of the solution instead of part of the problem." Dr. Wells didn't love the idea at first. It violated every modern metallurgical guideline she taught in class. But after running simulations and watching the stress points light up in deep reds and oranges, she admitted the plan might actually work, not just as a patch job, but as an improvement. "It's not traditional," she said, "but it's elegant." Getting the materials was another obstacle. The alloy they needed wasn't cheap, and it wasn't something you could just buy at the local hardware store. Tony made a call to a racing shop in Charlotte, one he hadn't spoken to in 20 years, and cashed in a favor that had apparently saved the owner's business during a bad season. The order was placed. The ingots were shipped overnight. It cost $4,000 Jack didn't have, but he didn't hesitate. He signed the invoice and told Mason quietly, "This is the line. After this, there's no going back." That night, Jack slept at the shop. So did Tony. Mason pulled an old cot from the storeroom. Dr. Wells went home only to return before sunrise with a thermocouple, welding blankets, and a solemn warning. The weld had to be flawless. The temperature window for the alloy was razor thin. Too hot, it would crack. Too cold, it wouldn't bond. They had one chance. The first weld attempt failed. 6 hours of preparation gone in an instant when the cooling process warped the casting. The sound of that crack as it split down the weld seam echoed in the shop like a gunshot. No one spoke for a long time, but they didn't give up. They analyzed the failure, adjusted the preheat temperature, controlled the cooling curve with thermal wraps. Tony suggested pre-stressing the alloy in the opposite direction so it would naturally tighten under operating heat. "It's not science," he said. "It's intuition plus math plus prayer." The second weld worked. They tested it, scanned it, hammered it. It held. But that was just the beginning. They still needed pistons, custom ones now, because the bore had to be machined oversized to accommodate the stress relief inserts. Mason researched specs while Jack called in favors. A contact at a machine shop in Atlanta agreed to sell them blank slugs at cost. Dr. Wells reached out to Georgia Tech for access to a precision CNC mill. Eddie offered to stay late and help with the machining process, even if he didn't fully understand what he was making. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I'll learn it as I go." The shop turned into a manufacturing line. Pistons were machined one at a time, 16 hours each, including stress testing, coating, and balancing. They needed 12. They made 15, just in case. Some failed inspection, a few cracked under heat, others passed with barely a millimeter to spare. It was painstaking, nerve-wracking, Every piston that passed was celebrated like a lottery win. Every failure was a lesson. By day 9, they had all 12. Still, the clock didn't stop, and as each hour ticked by, more people showed up. A local welder brought shielding gas. A retired electrical engineer offered to help with David's hand-built fuel injection system, which was now showing signs of age and incomplete programming. Jack let him try. He stayed for 12 hours straight, rewriting code with one hand while sipping coffee with the other. Even Father Miguel, the local priest, stopped by. He didn't offer advice, just walked into the shop, placed a hand on the engine block, and said, "May this young man's dream find peace." They were exhausted. Their hands ached. Their eyes burned from staring at tiny numbers, hairline cracks, torque values. But something incredible was happening. The engine, the one that had arrived in pieces wrapped in failure and grief, was coming back together. Slowly, beautifully, a little more each day. And so was the town around it. People who hadn't spoken in years stood shoulder to shoulder at the workbench. Competitors became collaborators. The shop that once felt like it was waiting to die had become a place of rebirth. And still, the deadline loomed. 6 days left, then 5, then 4. They weren't finished. Not yet. But Jack didn't feel fear anymore. He felt momentum. He felt purpose. He looked at the engine, at the notes David had left behind, and knew one thing with absolute clarity. They were going to finish this. Not because they had to, because they believed in it, because David deserved to hear what his dream sounded like. The final stretch began not with a bang, but with silence, the kind that comes just before the storm breaks. With 3 days left on the clock, Jack Brennan stood alone in the shop at dawn, staring at the almost complete Ferrari engine, the overhead lights casting long shadows across the smooth curves of polished aluminum and the tightly fastened lines of high-performance fuel rails. From the outside, it looked whole, even beautiful. But inside, Jack knew there were still dozens of steps, each critical, each unforgiving. The pistons were in. The cylinder heads had been torqued to spec, checked, rechecked. The custom fuel injection system, hand-built by a young man who never lived to test it, sat waiting like a brain without a pulse. The wiring loomed, calibration remained untouched, and there were only 72 hours left. It was no longer a question of whether they had the knowledge or the tools. It was time. Time was the enemy now, and like any good enemy, it gave no second chances. Mason was the first to arrive that morning, dragging his backpack behind him, eyes heavy from another night spent crashing on his grandmother's couch. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't have to. He simply grabbed a wrench and began checking the torque values on the intake manifold. One by one, others joined in. Tony limped in with a thermos of black coffee and 2 rolls of blueprints under his arm. Eddie showed up an hour early, already in coveralls, grease on his hands before the sun had fully risen. Dr. Wells returned with a student assistant and a sealed case of thermal sensors borrowed from the Georgia Tech lab, equipment worth more than Jack's entire shop. Nobody asked about the deadline anymore. They all knew. For the first time in weeks, the shop felt almost sacred. Conversations were quiet, focused. Every movement was deliberate. Jack didn't have to bark instructions or assign tasks. Everyone knew what they were there to do. For hours they worked in near silence, each team handling a piece of the puzzle. The injector rail assembly, the ignition timing, valve lash adjustments, fuel line pressure testing. No one complained. No one broke rhythm. They were too close, but it wasn't without obstacles. That afternoon, the first attempt to initialize David's custom fuel injection system failed completely. The computer lit up, but it refused to communicate with the sensor array. Error code scrolled across the small diagnostic screen in a flood of red. Jack and Dr. Wells spent 4 hours manually tracing wires, 63 of them in total, each one custom soldered by David himself, labeled in his precise handwriting, a language of loops and dashes only he truly understood. It became clear that some of the components had degraded during the years of storage. Others had likely never been fully tested in the first place. Jack refused to rip it out. Mason suggested retrofitting modern components, something more predictable. Jack shook his head. "If we're going to bring his work back to life," he said, "we're doing it on his terms." That night, Jack worked alone with the system until midnight, meticulously rebuilding a new set of connections with borrowed parts and salvaged boards from 3 different racing shops. He rewrote code line by line using David's handwritten logs, making educated guesses based on his own decades of tuning engines that didn't follow the rules. When he finally got the sensors to sync with the ECU, the little green light on the main board flickered once, then held, a sign of life, not victory, but something better, progress. 2 days remained. With the fuel injection system stabilized, the next task was injector calibration. Jack had never worked on a 12-cylinder system where each injector had its own trim adjustment. That had been David's innovation, an individually tunable setup meant to eliminate the uneven distribution that plagued older fuel rails. Genius, but delicate. Jack and Mason spent 6 hours programming pulse width values into the system using a rotary dial that clicked for each adjustment. Every click mattered. 1 too far and the combustion ratio would skew. 1 too short and the engine would choke on fuel. As they worked, the town outside took notice, more than usual. Rita brought an extra box of sandwiches and a thermos of sweet tea. Father Miguel returned with a candle, which he left burning near the entrance, no words needed. At one point, a small crowd gathered across the street, neighbors, retired machinists, even teenagers on skateboards, watching in respectful silence, as though something sacred was happening behind the garage doors. The next crisis hit hard and fast. Just 36 hours before the deadline, Mason got a call from Birmingham. The machine shop handling the final balancing of the connecting rods had finished the job. The rods were perfect, within half a gram, just as David had calculated. But Mason's truck broke down as he pulled out of the lot. Transmission failure. 4 hours away, stranded. Jack's heart dropped when he heard the news. Without those rods, the engine would remain incomplete. Every second mattered. There was no time to wait for a courier. Mason did what Jack knew he would. He didn't panic. He asked around the lot, called a few contacts. Nothing worked. Until a man in a faded green jumpsuit overheard his conversation and stepped forward. "I've got a bird," he said. "Helicopter. I do medical transports, but I'm between runs. If you're trying to get something home for a reason that matters, I'll fly it for gas money." Mason stared at him. "You serious?" The man nodded. "You guys fixing the Ferrari?" He held out a hand. "Captain Hayes." 4 hours later, the unmistakable sound of rotor blades echoed over Gearworks Boulevard as the helicopter touched down in the empty lot next to Brennan's auto. People poured onto the sidewalks, pointing and cheering as Mason climbed out of the cabin with the rods packed tightly in a reinforced case. He held them up like a championship trophy. Jack met him at the shop entrance, half in disbelief, half in tears. There wasn't time to waste. The last 24 hours became a blur. The rods went in at midnight. Jack and Tony torqued each one by hand, checking clearances, confirming rotation. Dr. Wells monitored temperatures. Eddie managed the timing sensors. Ava, who had taken the day off from the diner, handled parts organization like a field general. And when everything was finally assembled, when the fluids were topped off, when the wires were connected and the laptop showed every sensor reading green, they stood in a circle around the engine and held their breath. 6 hours remained. Jack looked at Connor, who had arrived that morning with red eyes and a silence that felt louder than words. "You should start it," Jack said. "It was his. It should be you." Connor nodded, walked over, placed a trembling hand on the ignition button, and paused. The weight of 3 years rested on his shoulders. Guilt, grief, hope. He pressed down. The engine turned, once, twice, then a growl. It coughed, misfired, struggled to catch. Everyone tensed. Jack moved quickly, reading the fuel maps. "Too rich," he said. "Give me 2 seconds." He made a quick adjustment. Connor tried again. The engine turned. and caught. The idol was rough, uneven, it sputtered, but it was alive. For a moment, no one said a word. Then Mason whispered, "It's breathing." But breathing wasn't enough. Not yet. Jack had less than 6 hours to tune every cylinder, fix every pulse, balance every input. One final push, one final test. They were almost there. Now they had to make it sing. The sun was just starting to rise when the phone call came. Jack hadn't slept, but he didn't feel tired. He was standing next to the engine, listening to the faint ticking sound it made as it cooled, tiny metallic pings that echoed like applause in the quiet of the shop. The idol had been tuned to perfection just before midnight. Every cylinder was firing in harmony. The V12 didn't just run, it purred, it growled, it sang like it had been waiting 3 years to be heard, and now it was ready, really ready. For the first time since this project had landed in his lap, Jack felt something deeper than satisfaction. He felt calm, settled, like something that had been broken a long time ago had finally been made whole. Connor was the one who stepped outside to make the call. His voice was low, barely audible through the thin shop windows. Jack didn't try to listen. He didn't have to. He knew exactly who Connor was calling. Preston Montgomery, the man who had built a business empire and then vanished into silence when his only son died. The man who, by all accounts, had erased David's name from his company, his projects, maybe even his life. The man who shut the doors of the very mill that had kept Steelton alive for generations. Jack didn't expect to see him. He assumed this was closure for Connor, not an invitation for more. But the world, Jack had come to realize, had a strange way of circling back around. He was still wiping down the engine bay when the black SUVs rolled up, not one, 3. Windows tinted, engines smooth, tires crunching softly over the gravel. Jack froze. Mason stood up straight, a rag in one hand, grease on his cheek. Eddie looked at the vehicles like he expected someone important to get out. And he wasn't wrong. Preston Montgomery stepped out of the first vehicle, tall, silver-haired, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit that looked like it didn't belong in a town like Steelton. But the way he moved told a different story. Measured, precise, like someone who understood machinery, not just money. Behind him were 3 men in suits and 1 woman with a leather briefcase who looked like she didn't blink unless it was part of a contract. Preston's eyes weren't the eyes of a CEO today. They were the eyes of a father who had come to face a ghost. "Mr. Brennan," he said, offering a hand. His voice was calm, quiet, and strained at the edges. Jack shook his hand. It was firm, steady, the hand of someone used to signing papers that changed lives. "Connor tells me the engine runs," Preston continued. "He tells me it runs better than it ever did." Jack didn't boast. He just nodded once and said, "It's ready when you are." Before they even approached the car, Preston stopped. His eyes locked on the V12 sitting in its cradle, its surface gleaming, every wire secured, every hose neatly routed. He stared at it like it was a memory brought back from the dead. "There's something I need you to understand," he said, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. 3 years ago, after David died, I shut everything down. His research lab, his projects, his team. I buried it all. Not because it wasn't good work, it was brilliant work, but because I couldn't face it. I couldn't face the fact that my son died chasing a dream I didn't take seriously until it killed him. No one interrupted. Preston walked slowly around the engine, his eyes taking in every angle, every inch of David's fingerprints, now fused with Jack's. I didn't know what he'd built. I didn't know the potential of what he'd started. I assumed he was just another rich kid trying to go fast. But a few weeks ago, I found a box in his apartment, full of notes, test logs, calculations, not just about performance, but about efficiency, emissions, long-term reliability. David wasn't just building a car, he was trying to reinvent the combustion engine. Preston looked up at Jack, his voice softer now. "You didn't just fix something broken, you completed something visionary." The woman with the briefcase stepped forward and opened it without a word. Inside was a thick, bound document, the kind you only saw in boardrooms and courtrooms. She handed it to Preston, who placed it carefully on the nearest workbench and turned it toward Jack. "This," he said, "is a proposal. Montgomery Industries wants to establish a research and development center dedicated to automotive innovation, but not in Atlanta, not in New York, here in Steelton, on the site of the old mill." Jack blinked. "Here? We'll hire local talent, train young engineers, fund scholarships, and develop David's technology into something that can change the world, but only if you agree to lead it." The words hung in the air like thunder waiting to fall. Jack stared at the binder. His name was on the cover, his shop listed as the Cornerstone site. There was a sketch of the facility, a mock-up of the curriculum, a budget sheet thicker than a phone book. Jack had spent the last 3 decades trying to keep a small-town shop alive. Now someone was offering to turn it into a global center for innovation. "I'm not an engineer," Jack said finally. "I'm a mechanic." Preston's smile was sad and honest. So was David. He just happened to use math instead of a wrench. Tony stepped forward, brushing off his hands on his coveralls. "Jack, I've watched you for 20 years. If anyone can teach the next generation how to bridge the gap between theory and practice, it's you. If David had had someone like you guiding him early on, maybe—" He stopped himself, swallowing the rest of the thought. Maybe he'd still be here. Jack looked around the room. At Mason, who had grown from a thief into a technician. At Eddie, now showing a younger volunteer how to calibrate valve timing. At Dr. Wells, reviewing sensor data with a student from the college. At Ava, standing near the door with wide eyes, holding the same binder Jack was too stunned to pick up. And suddenly, the answer wasn't complicated at all. "I'll do it," Jack said, "on one condition." "Name it," Preston replied without hesitation. Everyone who helped with this project, Mason, Eddie, Tony, Dr. Wells, even Billy Torres across town, they get the first call when you're hiring. This was a community effort. The opportunity stays here, where it started. Preston nodded. "Done." The handshake was quiet. The applause that followed wasn't. But before anything else could happen, Preston stepped forward again. He ran his hand along the engine once more, then looked at Jack. "Can I hear it?" Jack didn't answer. He just turned the key. The engine started instantly. The idle was smooth, rich, alive. Preston's face changed, not with shock or joy, but with peace. For the first time in 3 years, he saw his son's vision brought to life. He closed his eyes and listened. No words, just the sound of redemption, one perfectly tuned cylinder at a time. The news hit Steelton like a thunderclap in clear skies. Not long ago, this had been a town drifting slowly towards silence, defined by what it had lost. The steel mill, the jobs, the hope. But now, the story spreading through diner booths and barbershop chairs wasn't about decline. It was about rebirth. And it all centered on one man, one engine, and one choice that turned a dusty repair shop into the epicenter of something extraordinary. Preston Montgomery's decision to build the David Montgomery Automotive Research Center in Steelton changed more than just Jack Brennan's life. It sent shockwaves through the community. For years, Montgomery Industries had been little more than a name etched in bitterness, a symbol of a promise broken when the mill shut its gates and threw hundreds out of work. But now, the same name was returning with a new promise, not to extract, but to invest, not to erase history, but to rewrite it with purpose. The announcement came the next morning. Preston, Connor, and the corporate team returned to Jack's shop with finalized papers. The handshake had already sealed the deal in spirit. Now the contracts made it official. The research center would be built on the old mill site, a piece of land most people had stopped looking at years ago. It would begin with 40 jobs: engineers, machinists, fabricators, logistics specialists, and grow to over 100 in the first 5 years. Scholarships would be funded in David's name, aimed at local students, especially those who couldn't afford college otherwise. Internships, Apprenticeships and technical training programs would follow. Brennan's auto would remain, not as a relic of the past, but as a proving ground for the future, where theoretical concepts would meet the hands-on expertise that David had always admired but never lived long enough to master. And Jack Brennan? He would take on the role of technical director, not from behind a desk, not with a title on a door, but in the trenches, mentoring, testing, building. He didn't need to change who he was. The world had simply come around to realizing that people like him, people who fixed things the hard way, with sweat and skill and instinct, were worth building around. The reaction from the town wasn't subtle. Horns honked as people passed the shop. Kids who had once skateboarded past with blank stares now stopped to peer through the windows, their faces lit with something dangerously close to ambition. Rita's diner sold out of biscuits by noon. Someone painted a sign and hung it on the chain-link fence around the mill. Coming soon, the future lives here. But what stuck with Jack most was the moment he watched Mason pick up a clipboard and start drafting a parts inventory list for an upcoming training module. Mason, the same kid Jack had caught trying to hotwire a car behind the diner 3 years earlier, now stood tall, confident, focused. He was already talking about enrolling in the engineering program once it launched, hoping to split his time between coursework and shop floor experience. He wasn't dreaming about leaving town anymore. He was dreaming about building something here. Ava, too, had changed. She'd always been bright, mechanically inclined, curious in the way that engineers are born, not taught. But now she carried herself differently. When Preston offered her one of the inaugural scholarships to Georgia Tech, full tuition, books, housing, no strings, she said yes with her whole heart. She would leave Steelton to study, but not to escape. She'd be back, because there was something waiting for her now, a place where she could belong, where her skills would matter. Billy Torres, once Jack's fiercest competitor, didn't hesitate when asked to serve on the center's advisory board. "If this place had existed when I was young," he told Jack, "maybe I wouldn't have spent so much of my life trying to prove something alone." Eddie took a full-time position as a technical apprentice, while Dr. Wells accepted an offer to oversee the materials lab, bringing in more students from the college and integrating the facility into regional STEM programs. Even Father Miguel came by the shop one morning, still in his collar, holding a cup of coffee and a newspaper folded under his arm. "I always said this town needed a miracle," he smiled. "Turns out it was an engine." But for all the celebration, Jack knew the work had only just begun. Building the center would take months. Hiring, training, equipping, it would all come in waves, each one bigger than the last. But the blueprint was solid, the team was strong, and for once the future didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like something you could hold in your hands, shape with your tools, bring to life with your mind. On the evening of the official groundbreaking, the whole town showed up. The lot where the steel mill had once stood, lifeless for so long, was now full of lights, tents, chairs, and energy. Preston gave a speech, his voice clear, his message simple, that this was about more than repairing engines. It was about repairing trust. Connor spoke briefly, his voice catching when he talked about David and how this place would be his real legacy. Not the accident, not the unfinished engine, but the spark that came after. Then they turned to Jack. He didn't have notes. He didn't need them. He stood in front of his neighbors, his friends, his family, and spoke from the heart. "I never thought I'd be at the center of something like this," he said. "I've spent my life fixing what's broken, not dreaming about what's possible. But this engine, this project, it reminded me that sometimes the best things aren't built from scratch. They're built from what's left behind, when someone believes it can still be made whole. We took a broken machine and gave it a second chance, and now this town is getting the same. That's not because of me, it's because of all of you." The applause lasted long after he stepped down. That night, as fireworks lit up the sky above the mill site and kids ran between food trucks and folding chairs, Jack stood off to the side, arms folded, watching it all. Not overwhelmed, not uncertain, just deeply, fully present. Because somehow, against all odds, a mechanic who had once considered closing his shop had become the foundation for a future no one thought possible. And all because someone had dared to believe that even the most unfixable things could run again, if someone was willing to try. 5 years later, the hum of machinery echoed once again across the heart of Steelton. Not the harsh clang of steel from a smelting furnace or the whine of conveyor belts from a factory line, but the precise, rhythmic song of innovation. Turbochargers being calibrated, new combustion chambers undergoing real-time thermal stress testing. Teams of engineers and mechanics, students and veterans, gathered around engine rigs like surgeons at an operating table. This wasn't the Steelton people remembered, it was the Steelton they'd never dared to imagine. The David Montgomery Automotive Research Center had grown into something no one, least of all Jack Brennan, could have predicted. What began as a desperate bet on an unfixable engine had become the epicenter of a global conversation about combustion efficiency and sustainable performance. Companies sent their prototypes to be tested here. Automakers flew in their best minds to learn from the ones Steelton had raised. The research center had gained international recognition for its groundbreaking work, combining old-world engine craftsmanship with cutting-edge technological innovation. And at the center of it all was the same man who once thought his greatest accomplishment was simply keeping the lights on in a garage. Jack Brennan hadn't changed much in appearance. He still wore grease-stained shirts, still kept his sleeves rolled up, still preferred calloused hands to clean ones. But what had changed was everything around him. His small, humble shop had become the living workshop of the research center, its pulse. He still worked on engines, still took apprentices under his wing, still taught by doing. But now, those lessons rippled outward in ways he never thought possible. Students from engineering schools across the country competed for internships at Brennan's Auto. Automotive journalists wrote about the Steelton method, a practical, results-driven philosophy that balanced data with experience, theory with intuition. They even taught courses about it now. Jack's name was on the syllabus. Mason had finished his degree with top honors and returned to become the assistant technical director of the center. His growth was visible in every part of the operation. He'd taken David's experimental firing sequence algorithms and applied them to hybrid powertrains. He developed a method for dynamic balancing that reduced wear and extended engine lifespan by 40%. He still looked to Jack for wisdom, but now, the kid who once struggled to tie his boots on time had become a voice of authority in his own right. He was no longer just the student, he was becoming the teacher. Ava had gone on to complete her engineering degree and returned as well, only she didn't come back to work in her father's shadow. She came back with her own vision. She'd been leading a division focused on integrating combustion efficiency principles with electric hybrid platforms, bridging the past and future in a way that left industry veterans speechless. Her ideas earned patents. Her name appeared in white papers and conferences. And every time she walked into the garage at Brennan's Auto, she still kissed her dad on the cheek and asked, "So what are we building today?" Tony Romano had retired, again, but not really. He still showed up at least 3 days a week. They'd given him an honorary title, something impressive sounding, but everyone knew what he really was, the shop's soul. He taught by story, fixed things others gave up on, and made sure nobody forgot where this all began. Even Billy Torres had found a place. His shop merged operations with the research center, and Billy ran a performance lab focused on adapting combustion improvements for older engines. "If we're going to build the future," he said once, "we'd better bring the past with us." He and Jack still argued, still threw jabs at each other over torque specs and tuning decisions. But it was a brotherhood now, forged through fire and respect. The most incredible thing, though, was that none of this had started with grand ambition. It had started with pain, with loss, with one young man who died before he could finish what he started, and a town that had been left behind by the very name that now gave it new life. David Montgomery's legacy wasn't a car, it wasn't an engine, It was an idea. That excellence could come from anywhere. That genius could be found in grease-covered garages and taught with patience and purpose. That the best solutions aren't always the cleanest or the easiest, but the ones forged by hands that know the feel of real work. Jack had a wall in his office, if you could call it that, since it was really just the back room where the coffee pot lived and papers piled up. On that wall hung a photograph of the original Ferrari engine. Not the one they rebuilt into a trophy, but the one they first pulled from the crate, cracked, burned, broken. That photo sat next to another, David smiling next to his father, both hands on an open hood. The third photo was of the research center on opening day, flags flying, steel arches gleaming in the sun, Jack in the center of a crowd that had learned to believe again. He never looked at those photos out of pride. He looked at them to remember what it had taken to get there, to remember how many people had said it couldn't be done, to remember the sound of the engine the first time it finally ran, not just turned over, but really ran, smooth, alive, whole. Every once in a while, new visitors would come to the center, students, journalists, skeptics, corporate execs, and someone would always ask the same question: how did this place happen? How did this town become the place where everyone wants to send their engines? Jack always gave the same answer, the one that told the truth without needing a footnote. "Someone brought me a broken engine," he'd say, "said it couldn't be fixed. We fixed it anyway. Turns out that's what we do around here." And then he'd go back to work, just a mechanic, building futures one bolt at a time,